I'm an internist and cardiologist in Dallas, Texas. I'm professor of medicine at Texas A&M College of Medicine on the Baylor Dallas campus. I have my clinical practice there, so I see and examine patients every day with internal medicine and cardiovascular problems. I'm the current president of the Cardiorenal Society of America. It's a national medical society. I am the editor-in-chief of Cardiorenal Medicine.
For some people who think COVID is basically just the seasonal flu and maybe a bit worse, obviously every year old people die from the flu. And in Australia, there's actually been no excess deaths from COVID whatsoever. So what would you say to someone who just says, oh, it's just the flu? What would you say?
Some people think COVID-19 doesn't exist or SARS-CoV-2 doesn't exist. And I was just reading an analysis from Australia that opined along those lines. And I tend to disagree. I think it's real. And for the following reasons, is both the Chinese as well as labs in the United States sequence the virus. We can identify the virus in individuals. It's not influenza, it's the virus. It's SARS-CoV-2. Its entire genetic code is known. And so it can be fully sequenced. Of interest, it's sequenced in the GI tract. It's very difficult to sequence it completely out of the nasopharyngeal tract. And so the best we can do is maybe pick up a few sequences of the nucleocapsid from the nares. Otherwise, it's all about the GI tract. So in the United States, we rely on a lab in California headed up by Dr. Sabine Hazen that's clearly demonstrated the virus is there. And we knew early on that there was a blend of variants of the virus in every population. The other major difference between influenza and COVID-19 is that influenza itself is rarely the immediate problem that leads to severe illness and hospitalization. It's almost always a bacterial secondary pneumonia. In fact, a staphylococcal pneumonia is most common. So in my practice, I remember in 2018, 2019, we had some serious patients at my hospital that I was rounding on, and they had influenza, but the real problem was a secondary staphylococcal pneumonia. With COVID-19, it's quite interesting. There is a low rate of any secondary bacterial infections. It's almost COVID all the way. And instead of a secondary bacterial infection, COVID-19 does something very different than the flu, is it creates cytokine storm or an abnormal immune system activation, and then devastating thrombosis, microthrombosis and macrothrombosis. And we don't see that in influenza. So I'm pretty convinced they're two separate illnesses.
Coronaviruses have been around for decades. They're never going to go away. So what is different about this?
You're right. Coronaviruses, there's a whole family of them. They're the common cold. There was also the MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Distress Syndrome, and SARS-1. They all have homologies to one another. The difference between SARS-CoV-2, and the COVID-19 illness and the others appears to be genetic modification of the spike protein, so-called gain of function research. It looked like it was intentionally made in a laboratory in Wuhan, China, the Chinese Institute of Virology. That's where the action was, to make the virus far more contagious and far more dangerous. And it's the spike protein itself, the spicule on the surface of the virus, that really confers the pathogenicity of the virus. That's what makes the virus so deadly, is the spike protein.
But would you actually classify it a pandemic?
I think it's fair to say it's a pandemic. It's certainly broad enough, and it's occurred in clusters. Now, it's not a tsunami. It's not a tidal wave. And I'll never forget last year when New York was being hit very hard, and I was here in Dallas, Texas, and Senator Mario Cuomo got on TV and said, Chicago, Dallas, you're going to be next, like a big tsunami. And I immediately looked at that. I'm a trained epidemiologist. I have a degree in epidemiology from University of Michigan, in addition to my MD and my other degrees. And I looked at this and I said, there's just no way this virus is moving like a tsunami. And I needed a window to communicate to America, since our academic publication cycle is so slow. And I became a regular contributor to a political journal, The Hill, and I published a series of opinion editorials through 2020, intentionally to tell Americans what was going to happen. And in fact, I called it right away. My first paper was, listen, it doesn't work like a tsunami. This virus occurs in outbreaks and clusters, and it tend to hit cities that were quite vertical, where there's very little airflow, people living in high-rise buildings, where there was multi-generational households. And when the mortality really skyrocketed, it's because the health systems are overwhelmed and they simply just didn't have enough resources to care for the number of people in that short period of time. It happened in Milan, it happened in New York and New Jersey. And to this day, the deaths per million population were highest there. Now, certainly there were outbreaks, but the models were so terrible in predicting what's going on. So in Dallas, our Dallas County Convention Center, the US Army came in and made it an Army field hospital. They had thousands of beds, they had IVs set up, everyone was there ready to take care of all these victims coming in on stretchers, and not a single person came to the Dallas County Convention Center. And I mentioned that in one of my op-eds. I said, they are wasting their time. And the reason why the models were so wrong is the models made several assumptions that were just absolutely massive blunders. And they came actually out of the University of Washington in Seattle. That's where I did my residency. The Murray model came out of the University of Washington. So, I had a connection there. And they were assuming that roughly 40 to 50% of all the spread of COVID-19 was from asymptomatic persons. So asymptomatic person passes to asymptomatic. And it turns out that was completely wrong. Asymptomatic people do not pass it to one another. It's sick person passes it to a susceptible person, and that's how the virus spreads. The other thing is the virus spreads 85% of the time from household contacts inside the home. And people are going outside thinking, they're at a gas station or a grocery store or a restaurant. They thought they were going to get it there. But in fact, the risk was really at home. So this asymptomatic spread was a huge blunder in all the models. And the other things the models never took into consideration is the impact of early treatment. And so early treatment was actually squashing the curves in countries where it was used, because early treatment can reduce the duration of the viral replication from about 14 days to 4 days. People stay in the home so they don't go out and spread it to others. So it reduces the spread, reduces the intensity and duration of symptoms. And we know now that early multi-drug treatment reduces hospitalization and death by 85%. So these were huge things that blew these models out of the water, and in many ways made COVID-19 become much more controllable over time. In Australia, you've always benefited from the fact that you haven't had giant outbreaks. And with a good early treatment program, this illness is very manageable by the health systems. No need for lockdowns, no need for asymptomatic testing. And society can go on as it should, provided the early treatment protocols are in place.